This is a production of Cornell University Library.
So it's really great to be giving this talk here in Mann Library because this was my refuge during the time that I wrote this book. Third floor, west side of the building, great place to work. So it's kind of really fitting to be giving the talk here. So thank you for inviting me, Mary, and thanks to everybody for coming. So when most people think about bees, they invariably think about some very common species. The European honeybee, for example, comes to mind, or a bumblebee, like the American bumblebee, Bombus pennsylvanicus. But bees are far more diverse than just the familiar species that you're all used to seeing around your house. There are over 20,000 described species of bees. That's 5 times as many bees as there are mammals on Earth. There are about 4,000 bee species in North America, 420 or so in New York State. So bees are quite a rich group in terms of species richness and diversity. And if you divide bee species by life history and you kind of tabulate what the different types of life histories are, you get a pie chart like this. So the vast majority of bees are solitary, and I'll tell you what that means in a little bit. A small slice are social, about 9.4%. A chunk here, 13%, are brood parasites, and I'll tell you more about those in a little bit. Those are bees that enter the nests of solitary bees and lay their eggs without doing any hard work. And then a tiny slice are these social parasites that attack social hosts. So if we lump together the solitary bees and the brood parasites, you're talking about a little more than 90% of all bee species on Earth. So just numerically, this is really the bulk of bee diversity. These lesser-known bees are the subject of the recent book that I wrote with my co-authors, Bob Minckley and Jack Neff. And I want to give you an overview of the book by introducing you to some aspects of bee diversity that I hope you've never heard about before. The goal of the book was to kind of bring together all the literature on solitary bee biology, interpret it in a modern phylogenetic framework, and prepare a kind of comprehensive view of solitary bee biology and the brood parasites that attack them. So we need to start out with a sort of basic question. What is a solitary bee? And to illustrate this, I picked one example. This is one of my favorite bees. This is Hesperapis rhodocerata. This is the bee that's on the cover of the book. I was collecting them 3 weeks ago in southern Arizona. And this is just a great example of a typical solitary bee. And so I want to walk you through its life cycle to explain, to give you a good sense of what this bee is like. This is a univoltine bee, so 1 generation per year. Adults emerge in a very short period of time, late August to early September. They don't always emerge. In drought years, they won't emerge, for example. The rains bring out these bees in large numbers. They are host plant specialists on plants in the family Asteraceae, a small number of genera that are closely related. They're ground nesting, like a lot of solitary bees. And they're solitary, which means that each nest is occupied by a single female. She constructs the nest herself, provisions the brood cells, lays her own egg, defends the nest against parasites and predators, and doesn't share a nest with other females. There's no cooperation among females. There's no reproductive division of labor. Yeah, that's a good question. So we don't really know, but that female may be kind of fending off males that are trying to pounce on her. That's my theory, but I'm not totally sure that's correct. But they do that. This group of bees does that. So this is the habitat that this bee lives in. This is the mixed Chihuahuan desert grassland of southern Arizona. This is Eduardo Almeida, a former graduate student in our department, who was out at the bee course this past August. And it's mixed Chihuahuan desert grassland. It's dry for 10 months out of the year, and maybe a month and a half you get heavy late summer rains, and it brings out the flowers. This is a host plant specialist bee, so that its host plant at this site was Xanthisma or pectus. These are low-growing asters. Each female constructs a burrow in the ground, which looks like this, that leads to a series of cells. Here's a little brood cell. Within that brood cell, she provisions pollen and nectar, lays an egg, and then the larva consumes that pollen and eventually reaches this last instar larval stage where it's defecated, and now it's going to overwinter in that stage. So these bees literally spend about 3 weeks of their life as adults and the rest of the time as these last instar larvae. Now I have a little video to show you. We took these just recently. This is a female digging her nest. We visited this site repeatedly over the course of about 10 days. And we came back to the site again and again and again and found little activity. And then bang, all of a sudden, on one day, we found all these females, I mean hundreds of them, digging their nests furiously in the ground. This is slow motion. And there were thousands of nests of this bee in this small area. And they're all digging a nest that's about 60 centimeters deep. And they do it by flinging the soil away from the nest. Some bees bulldoze, this bee sprays. So it's really quite a dramatic thing to see this site transformed from a site with no bee activity, at least not this bee, to a site with thousands of active nests. And that's typical of these solitary bees. There is a long period where there's no activity and a short period where there's a lot of activity. The egg looks like this, the feeding larva looks like this, and eventually the overwintering stage looks like this. This is the last instar larva that will survive through the winter, through the dry period of the year, and that larva can remain in diapause for up to 5 years. So think of these bees as seeds in the ground. They remain in diapause until the weather conditions are right, until the late summer rains come again, and then they emerge en masse, and the whole cycle starts again. So there's really bed hedging, interesting levels of bed hedging going on here. All right, so let's take that bee as an example of a typical solitary bee, and let's make a list of traits that solitary bees that distinguish solitary and social bees. The period of adult activity is short in solitary bees, whereas it's long in social bees. Think honeybees; they're active from March all the way through October. There's usually one generation per year in a solitary bee, but the social bees have to have multiple generations to rear obviously to have worker broods. Solitary bees are largely, well, not largely, but many of them are host plant specialists. Host plant specialization is quite common in solitary bees. And social bees, as far as we know, usually are generalists. They're almost always generalists. And if you look at the biogeographic distribution of bees, the deserts and the Mediterranean climate regions are the sites where you have the highest species richness of solitary bees. Solitary bees are beautifully adapted to these dry, harsh environments where rainfall is unpredictable and occurs in a short window of time. Whereas social bees really have their greatest diversity in the tropics. In the tropics, you get stingless bees, honeybees, allodapine bees. All the social bees seem to thrive in tropical environments where flowering occurs over a long period of time and there's no real discrete seasonality. So those are some of the basic biological differences between these two groups of bees. So now I want to walk you through some examples of that we kind of uncovered in the course of writing this book. Some aspects of bee diversity that were just I mean, sometimes amazing to me because I had never come across these stories. So I want to give you a sense of the diversity in nesting behaviors, the diversity in bee plant interactions, diversity in mating, and then we'll talk a little bit about the brood parasites, which are incredibly cool and interesting and evil-looking bees. All right, so diversity in nesting biology. We distinguished 4 broad categories of nesting biology in solitary bees: the ground nesters, the wood nesters, what we call the renters, and the above ground builders. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of examples of each of these. Most bees build a nest that's on average about 30 centimeters deep. So not a terribly deep nest. Some bees build a nest that's only a couple of centimeters deep. There are some bees that build nests that are extraordinarily deep, and I'm talking about 2 meters to 3 meters deep in the soil. And this is one of my favorite examples. This is Oxea flavescens, which was excavated by Radcliffe Roberts in 1973 in Brazil. And this nest was 2 meters deep, and if you read his paper, he describes worrying about the hole he had dug collapsing on him and killing him, because he was down at the bottom of that, digging away with a penknife. The excavation took 3 days. And in the end, he was able to uncover all the different brood cells that were associated with that nest. So for some reason, some bees build these incredibly deep nests. Sometimes they're bees that nest in very sandy soils, like dune systems, where the soil is shifting constantly, and you want your brood cells to be very deep in the soil. Other bees do interesting things. So that's the typical ground nester, but there's some very creative soil nesting bees, and one of those is this genus called Gasochira, which is a neotropical group of longhorn bees. These are bees that nest in the outsides of arboreal termite nests. So the termites build a mud nest in a tree, and these bees excavate, open a burrow into that mud covering, and they create brood cells, and they provision those brood cells with pollen, and they lay their eggs. So they're living closely with the termites, and they're probably benefiting from these termites, but they're specialized on termites. You don't find them nesting anywhere else. This is one of my favorite bees. This is Megachile pluto, the largest bee on Earth. This is also a bee that nests in termite nests. But it nests in termite nests in Indonesia, in just a few islands in this archipelago of Indonesia. And this is a fantastic bee. This was a bee originally collected by Alfred Russel Wallace, not described by him, but collected by him in his expeditions to Southeast Asia. And it is a massive bee. It received an enormous amount of media attention recently. In February of this year, an expedition of entomologists went to Indonesia to verify that this bee was still around and we could still find it. And they returned with photographs of the bee on the arboreal termite nest that it was nesting in. So it's still here, and it's turning into just a fantastic kind of icon for bee conservation. We'll have these on display at the Museum of the Earth starting tomorrow as part of a bee exhibit. So I encourage you to come out and have a look at the largest bee on Earth in the exhibit. Other bees do interesting things. So this is a bee that nests in sandstone. So this bee chooses the hardest, most difficult soil to dig in. This was a bee described and studied by Michael Orr, who was a Cornell undergrad in our department, now a graduate student at the Logan Bee Lab. Some bees nest on the edges of active volcanoes. So this is a report of a bee that nests in the very fine soil on the margins of these active volcanoes. Great story. Who could have thought of that? All right, so those are all soil nesters or ground nesters. So let's talk about renters. Renters don't bother building a nest from scratch. They use pre-existing cavities. And they'll use all kinds of cavities, from hollow stems, beetle burrows, snail shells, living plants, hydraulic tubing of aircraft, the window sealant around your back door, anything that's got a cavity that they can burrow into, that they can partition up into a nest. This is Osmia cornifrons, one of our local very common mason bees. And you can see here's the nest. That's the entrance to the nest. She's plugged it at the end of her foraging and provisioning with a big thick mud plug. And you can see she's created a brood cell here, 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 and here. Each brood cell is separated by mud. And in each brood cell, there's pollen and an egg or a developing larva. And you can see these brood cells in the back are larger than the pollen provisions in the front. That's because they're shifting sex ratio as they go forward. They're making females in the back and males in the front. And this bee was studied extensively by Mary Centrella, who's right there. All right, leafcutter bees. Many people have heard of these. They're fantastic little stem nesters, renters. They cut leaves using their sharp mandibles. They carry the leaves back to the nest. And they use the leaves to line the brood cell. And these leaves that they're picking are often have antibiotic properties. So they keep fungi and bacteria from growing. So these bees are very selective in their choice of leaves. Some of you may be familiar with the wool carder bees. The large local wood carder bee is Anthidium manicatum. This is a bee that you'll see in your garden if you have any plants with kind of woolly leaves like this. Females have comb-like mandibles that they use to rake off those plant fibers. They carry them back to the nest, and they partition their chambers up with these plant fibers, creating a kind of woolly structure like this. There's a series of brood cells here, and they impregnate that wool with resins from plants that makes it even more resistant to microbial attack. So these bees are doing a very interesting thing with plants and their plant secondary compounds. Now, some bees have kind of kicked it up a notch, in terms of artistic talent. These are bees that build brood cells out of flower petals. So some bees choose particular flower petals. They're very soft and easy to manipulate. It's probably not because they're brightly colored. They carry them back to their chamber in the ground, and they construct these beautiful brood cells with the flower petals sometimes sticking up out of the ground if they're built in a very shallow site. So that's a pretty neat adaptation to nesting in a cavity. Some bees choose snail shells. There's a whole group of bees in the tribe Osmiini that are specialized on snail shells. And this is an illustration of one of those bees, Hoplites zandani. And you can see in the old world, there are a lot of terrestrial snails, and when they die, their snail shells are laying around on the ground. So these are great cavities for bees to nest in. And you can see this female has partitioned up this snail shell. There's her pollen provision. She's plugged the entrance with sand and soil to keep her brood cell safe from attack. So snail shell nesting is a pretty nifty trick in the renters. Now, I love this story. So in urban downtown Toronto, the leafcutter bees have been forced to switch to plastic bags because there aren't enough leaves around, I guess. And so this is a report by Scott McIver of plastic use in leafcutter bees in downtown Toronto. So these bees are very adaptable, and they're very creative in their use of materials. Let's move on to wood nesters. So wood nesters are probably familiar to many of you if you have carpenter bees in your backyard. They nest in solid wood. There are other wood nesters that are less familiar to people. Ceratina, the small carpenter bees, are also effectively wood nesters, although it's pithy wood. There are some interesting other groups that nest in wood. One interesting adaptation among the wood nesters is the switch to horse dung. So horse dung is kind of like soft wood. When it's laying on the ground, you can dig into it. This is a fantastic bee called Trichothurgus bolithophilus, and that's a bolito in Spanish. That's a horse dropping. And so these bees specialize in making their nests in those dried horse droppings. Now, the puzzle is, what did they do before horses arrived in the New World? This is a bee from Argentina. So we think they probably nested in dense clumps of grass, and that was probably where they were nesting. But they've switched over now to horse droppings. Some bees build above ground nests. This is a category that we call the freestanding nest builders. This is a resin bee, Dianthidium, and you can see the kind of resin nest that she constructs. She's gathered stones and pebbles. She's glued it all together with resins. They have salivary secretions that they use to soften the resin and bring it back to the nesting site. And once it's been constructed into a brood cell, the resin then hardens very solid, and it really becomes very resistant to parasite and predator attack. It also probably has antimicrobial properties to keep the brood cells from getting infected. So that's a typical above ground nester using resins. Some above ground nesters use wool. So this is a wool carder bee, but instead of building in a cavity, she builds her nest on a stem. This is a bee in southern Africa. They build these big fluffy cotton-like nests, and there's an entrance somewhere in here which she goes into. And they'll combine feathers, mammal hair, but it's mostly wool from plants. So this is Serapista, a really fantastic little genus of southern African bees. So we call this an above ground builder. All right, so that's a bit of the diversity of nesting styles that these solitary bees have. I want to now talk a little bit about the diversity in floral relationships. Because while social bees are all polylectic, many of the social bees have much more intimate relationships with their host plants. In some cases, highly specialized relationships involving modifications of behavior and morphology for harvesting particular floral rewards. So what I want to do is talk about oligolectic specialist bees, buzz pollinating bees, and then oil bees. And we kind of framed this chapter in the context of love story versus arms race. So we typically think of bees and plants as kind of a love story. Bees are out pollinating the plants to make the world a better place for all of us, to give us food to eat. But it's far more complicated than that. Bees are really herbivores gathering floral resources from plants that the plants don't want to give away for free. And the plants are trying to manipulate those bees to limit their floral resource loss, but also get some pollination out of the deal. So I love this kind of thinking about this as a love story and or an arms race. And really, it's something in between where each partner is benefiting, but each partner is also trying to keep the other one at a little bit of a safe distance. So let me give you some examples of specialist bees that seem to be almost detrimental to their host plants, which is a little bit of an odd way to think about it. So this is a highly specialized bee, Colostoma rapunculi, from the Old World. Its host plant is Campanula rapunculus, this beautiful flower right here. The flower produces 83,000 pollen grains. A beautiful study by Clemens Schlinwein showed that the bees collect 95.5% of that pollen. The plants are actually utilizing 3.7% in plant reproduction. So the bees are a huge drain on pollen production in these plants, but in the end it works out for the plant because they don't really need that many pollen grains to fertilize the ovules. But it's pretty amazing to think that most of this pollen that's being produced here, and that's expensive stuff to produce, it's high in protein content, it's energetically expensive to produce, it's remarkable that the bees are really stealing most of it. Another nice illustration of this is a study by Parker et al. Of a bee called Andrena aeruginii, which is a visitor to Claytonia in the spring, and this study was done in Canada. And they found that Andrena actually harvests much more pollen and deposits less pollen than the generalist floral visitors that visit this host plant. So the specialist is actually a drain on the system. And they commented that Andrena aeruginii may be more detrimental than beneficial to plant reproduction. That's pretty amazing to think about when we think of bees as pollinators all the time. We think of them as always beneficial, while they're often detrimental. Another one of my favorite examples is one we came across when we were doing research for the book, which is this story of a highly host plant specific bee, Andrena astragali, which only visits a plant called Toxicoscordium paniculatum, or death camas. Death camas are toxic plants. They kill vertebrates. They can kill humans, horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, and chickens. Okay, so you don't want to eat that stuff. But there is a highly host plant specific bee that only collects the pollen of this plant. There are no other generalist visitors because the pollen is probably fairly toxic. But this bee has overcome those toxins, and this is the toxin right here, and now it's a specialist on that plant. And in fact, that plant relies on it for its reproduction. So that's a great example of this really intimate partnership that you have in solitary bees between the bee species and a particular host plant. All right, so that's a few examples of highly host plant specific bees and the consequences of host plant specialization for the bee and for the plant. Another way that plants can protect themselves, so one way they can protect themselves is to make their pollen fairly toxic to the generalists and only accessible to a few species that can overcome those toxins. Another way to defend themselves is through the development of poricidal anthers. So if any of you are familiar with solanum, tomatoes and potatoes, they have anthers that are closed. So the pollen is enclosed within that tube-like structure, and the only way to get it out is to vibrate that tube at the right frequency to kind of spray the pollen out. You can chew into it, but that's very inefficient, and that would be really, there's not many bees that do that. But these plants are highly adapted to buzz pollinating bees, bee species that can land on the flower and vibrate the flower at the right frequency. And most bees do this with their thoracic flight musculature. So when they land on the flower, you hear them going bzz, 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 and then they'll move on to the next flower. And they'll milk the flower for its pollen. But there was a fantastic study that was recently published, and I just want to show you the video from this study, of a bee called Amygilla murriensis. This is the head-banging bee. And this is a bee that vibrates these poricidal anthers, but in a very unusual way. It doesn't use its thoracic flight musculature. It's going to bang its head on the anther at a very high frequency. And this entire video is documenting about 1 second of this floral visit. This was shot in Adelaide in the Botanical Gardens. She hasn't really started yet. There she goes. And the pollen is tumbling out onto her stomach, right, onto the ventral surface of her body here. Yeah. And then she'll groom it onto her hind legs. And you can see she already has some pollen here. So that's an unusual mode of buzz pollination, but it's an effective one. And turns out that buzz pollination really only occurs in a small number of bee genera. And honeybees, for example, don't buzz pollinate. So honeybees can't be used effectively as tomato pollinators because they don't know how to buzz those flowers. Bumblebees do a good job, and then a variety of other kinds of bees. So now she's going to fly off. She's gotten her load of pollen, and she'll groom it onto her hind legs. All right, so I want to talk about one other kind of floral resource that's less familiar to people than pollen and nectar, and that's floral oils. There are about 458 bee species in 14 genera that are oil bees. And these are bees that are highly specialized for collecting oils from a small number of plant families that produce oils. And these are nutrient-rich oils. Think of olive oil as a kind of analog. This is Lysimachia, one of our local oil-producing plants. The oil glands are at the base of this flower in the sort of reddish area there. And this is its host plant, Macropus nuda, that's a specialist on those Lysimachia. And the Macropus have specialized rakes for breaking open the oil glands and for grooming them onto their hind legs. And they have specialized Velcro-like or sort of velvet-like hairs that they use to carry the floral oils. This is a bee you can collect in New York State, but it's a very rare bee, and it's actually one that we're really concerned about in terms of conservation. So no social bees do oil collecting. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon. This oil collecting syndrome is restricted to solitary bees. And it means the plants are attracting a very particular kind of floral visitor. In southern Africa, there's an oil bee called Rediviva that visits a plant called Diascia. And the oil here is the end of these spurs. And the bee has to put its forelegs into the spur to mop up the floral oils. So these bees have enormously elongate legs. And there's some species called like Rediviva gigas that have enormously elongate forelegs. So they have to mop up those floral oils and then bring the oil, groom the oil back onto their hind legs. So this is just kind of one of those weird floral rewards that most people don't know about, but it's a fascinating one, and it's led to some really interesting bee-plant relationships. Another southern African oil-collecting bee is Tinoplectra. These are beautiful metallic bees that go to this cucurbit mormortica, and they have special oil-collecting rakes and combs on their legs and abdomen for collecting the floral oils from these plants. So I don't want to just talk about female bees here. I want to talk a little bit about male bees. And so we have a chapter on male mating behavior in solitary bees and the strategies that males have evolved for mating with females, for gaining access to females. And we distinguish the kind of two main strategies into two categories. And this is Jack Neff's kind of creativity here. He called one strategy the race to be first and the other strategy the race to be last. Most bees follow the race to be first. And this is because females in most bee species mate early in life, and then they stop being receptive to mating. And so the race is to be the first male, to be a male that's out early and pounces on females before they have mated with another male. So a typical mating system in bees, in solitary bees, is illustrated by Calides heteri. You form these kind of mating piles or balls of males around a female, and these are this is called scramble competition mating, and those males grapple with each other and they try to kick each other off. And it's quite a dramatic thing to see, but it lasts for only a short period of time early on in the nesting season. Another bee that illustrates the race to be first is Amygilla dawsoni. This is a bee that occurs in Western Australia in very dry, arid regions of northwestern Australia. They form massive nesting aggregations. And this is a huge bee. This is a bee that's about, it's the size of a queen bumblebee. This is a female emerging from her nest. This is a male waiting for her to come out so he can pounce on her. And so you get clouds of males pouncing on females over the nest site, and you can see how dense the nest sites are. There are thousands of nests in a small area. So at the peak of mating, it's just a crazy scene. And so my colleague Steve Buckman was kind enough to send me a video that he took at an Amygilla nest site in Western Australia. And this is with an iPhone. He just put his iPhone on the ground on a tripod and shot the sort of cloud of males that are flying around. And some of these things look like, they're just gigantic. So here are the nests, and those are mostly males just looking around for females. And the males occur in two different sizes. They're small males and they're large males, although they're kind of broadly overlapping. The large males mostly remain around the nest site, and the small males remain on the periphery of the nest site. And the small males are probably overall less successful than the larger males, but occasionally a female makes it out, to the periphery of the nest site, and the small males get a chance to mate out there. So this is a fantastic bee. It's not one I've ever seen, but it was featured in one of the David Attenborough series. All right, so what about the race to be last? Why would you want to be the last one to mate? Well, it turns out that in some bees, females mate throughout their life, and females store sperm like most insects, and sperm is used in the reverse order from which it's received. And so if you're the last male to mate with a female, you have a higher probability of paternity than a male that mated earlier in the day with that female. So in certain groups of bees, there is a race to be last. And those groups include some andrenid bees in the desert southwest, one of which I studied as a graduate student, this bee Macrotera portalis. Now, one strategy to be the last one to mate with a female is to remain attached to her while she's foraging. So there's studies that show in other kinds of andrenid bees that males will remain with females as they're foraging, and they'll become much more clingy as the day goes on, right? Because they don't want to, once they've gotten attached to a female, they don't want to let her mate with another male before she goes back to her nest and lays her egg. But that requires you have to sort of follow the female around all the time, and you become a real burden. This bee does something really interesting. So in this bee, males have evolved into two different morphs. There's a flight-capable morph, a kind of normal-looking bee like this. This is a female, but that's a small-headed male that mates on flowers. But if you dig up the nests, within the nests, you find these gigantic flightless males. So these are males with no flight musculature. They have wings, but they don't function. They have an enormous head, which is used for fighting among males within the nest. They can kill each other in these fights. And what they do is they wait around in the nest while the female is provisioning her brood cell. And at the very last moment, when the female is just getting ready to lay her egg, the male grapples with her and tries to mate with her. And this is really probably a very effective strategy for replacing any sperm that would have been acquired by that female, but from small males on flowers, and therefore you're increasing your own sort of probability of paternity. But these males are quite extraordinary, and this phenomenon, this dimorphism in male morphology, has arisen in other groups of bees. It's arisen in Andrenidae and Halictidae, but it's very rare and it's very unusual. Okay, let's talk about the brood parasitic bees. These are some of my favorite bees. These bees don't build a nest. They don't gather pollen. They don't provision a brood cell. They just kind of skulk around the nest site and look for opportunities to lay their eggs. And this is, many of them are brightly colored and beautiful things. This is Thyreus from the old world. Those are hares, those are white hares. Some of the Thyreus are blue, beautiful things. And they attack species in the genus Anthophora and Amygilla. And there's two modes. You can break into a closed brood cell, or you can lay an egg in a partially provisioned brood cell. So there are different strategies that these brood parasitic bees have. Here's an example of a bee that breaks into a closed brood cell. This is the host, Anthophora plumipes, and the parasite, Melecta albifrons. And here's an illustration of the brood cell. There's the egg of the host, and there's the egg of the brood parasite. And the brood parasite's opened that brood cell after the host has closed it. She's laid her egg in the brood cell. And what's going to happen? This egg is going to hatch, and out of it is going to come this scary-looking larva with big mandibles. And it's going to slide across the pollen provisions and kill that egg right there. And then it's going to consume the pollen provisions. So this bee, Melecta, didn't do any hard work. She just snuck into the nest of another bee and laid her egg. Now this is just to give you an idea of how scary these larvae are. These are first instar larvae of two groups of bees, Triopiolus and Epiolus. And I want you to look at their mandibles. These things are deadly killers. They crawl around the brood cell. They puncture the egg or early instar larva of the host, and then they consume the pollen provisions of the host. So it's a brilliant strategy, no hard work, and lots of reproduction. And they're beautiful things. So here's a blue thyreus. This is a Epiolus. This genus occurs around here. Ericrosis is a parasite of the genus Centris in arid regions of the world. Okay, so these bees comprise about 12% of all bees on Earth and about 20% of the family Apidae. So pretty unusual and interesting phenomenon. And brood parasitism doesn't really occur as frequently in the hunting wasp, the close relatives of bees. It's quite rare in hunting wasps, but quite common in bees. All right, so I want to thank a few people who've helped with this. Well, first of all, with the book, and then, well, mostly with the book. Yeah, with the book. So my two co-authors, Jack Neff and Bob Minckley, who were really fun to work with. We had a lot of email exchanges over the course of the last 4 years, lots of phone calls, lots of collaborative communication. Two people in Ithaca helped tremendously with this book. One is Maria Van Dyke, who is not here, I think, because she had to go home early. But Maria works in my lab and was incredibly helpful as we assembled all the material for this book. She helped with literature research. She helped with bibliographic databasing. She helped with table and figure formatting. She helped with layout. She helped with research. So Maria was just fantastic to work with. And really, I owe a lot to her help to get the book done. And then Francie Fawcett is a local illustrator who couldn't be here today. But Francie did all the illustrations in the book, all the black and white illustrations, and actually one of the color illustrations. And she's a local freelance artist who works with entomology, people in entomology. And she redrew many figures and really kind of made the figures look beautiful. So there are over 60 figures in the book, and Francie did a beautiful job with those. I want to thank the people in my lab over the period of time that we were working on this book. The graduates and undergraduates and postdocs who really were so much fun to talk to about this project and to share ideas with. And some of them are here today, so thank you. I want to thank my family who put up with lots of, lots of time in the library and trips to visit Jack and Bob. Anyway, thanks to my family, Marina, Caio, Nicholas, and Isabel Danforth. And then here's a long list of people at Cornell that I'd like to thank as well. So Dean Bohr for a sabbatical leave, Laura Harrington for approving that. The CUIC, the Cornell Insect Collection, our second floor staff in entomology really helped tremendously all the work that we're doing. I really appreciate the work that the folks at Mann Library do to make sure that we have the literature accessible to us to do these kinds of projects. The local pollinator group that meets within the Department of Entomology, mentors, and then USDA and NSF for funding. So thank you very much. Yeah.
That was wonderful, thank you. How do you take those beautiful photos of individual bees on a white background with their shadows? Or do you have to knock them out?
Those are photos by a guy named Joe Wilson. So I don't claim credit for those, but I know how he does it. He collects the bees in the wild, chills them down in the fridge, and then he puts them in a little white kind of tent like this. So he throws them in, they're still cold and kind of groggy, and they eventually kind of start to wake up, and then he takes photos of them, with his camera, with a lot of flash and a lot of light. So he does, those are beautiful photos, I agree. He authored a book called The Bees in Your Backyard, which I would recommend. It's also another Princeton book, and it's a beautiful guide to the bees, bee identification. And he shot all those photos. So yeah, that's one strategy. Yep. Yeah.
I have two questions. One is, what do the bees that collect oil do with the oil?
Oh yeah, so the oil collector bees, the oil replaces nectar. So they mix it with their pollen provisions. So they still have to collect pollen, but they mix with the oil with the pollen provisions as a food for the larvae. Then they also use the oil to line the brood cell. So it actually becomes a kind of waterproofing material.
So like propolis substitute?
Propolis is, what is propolis? More waxy kind of stuff, right, Tom? Yeah. No, it's actually, think of olive oil. It's sort of painted on the walls of the brood cell. And it seems to waterproof those brood cells. So for example, Macropus, the bee that we have around here that's an oil bee, nests in very boggy habitats. And we think that it can nest in those boggy habitats because it has this, it utilizes these floral oils. But they're also rich as a nutrient source, so they're mixed into the pollen provisions as well.
My other question is, if the solitary bees are spending such a short period of their life as adults,
Yeah.
and they may only emerge every 5 years, whatever,
Right.
how much can they be counted on as pollinators?
So that's a good question. In the places where they are, where their emergence is triggered by rainfall, I mean, they're coming out in the same years that that their host plants are coming out. So I don't think, so in other words, their emergence is tied with the host plant emergence. Where we live, we don't really have that heavy-duty bed hedging going on. Most of the bees around here emerge every year pretty reliably because we have high rainfall and it's very predictable. It's in the deserts where you get that very unpredictable, where there's very unpredictable rainfall, where you get these long-term periods of diapause.
So, but if they're alive for such a short period, do different species emerge at different times during the season, take advantage of different flowering times?
Well, remember this, the seasonality is very short in a desert, so it's, oh, around here, yeah, right, there's a lot of phenological variation. Yeah, so there's an early spring fauna, there's a midsummer fauna, there's a late summer fauna, there's an early fall fauna. So each species comes out in a different time window of 3 to 4 weeks, I would say, and then they're gone. So for example, around here, Solidago is now blooming. There's a fauna of Solidago specialists that come out only in the late summer when the goldenrod is in bloom. And so they're tied with their host plant quite closely. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Scott.
I don't think I've ever asked you that. I'm going to put you on the spot. What's your favorite species of bee?
My favorite bee. My answer is usually the family Melididae, because that gives me about 200 species of just incredibly cool bees. So since I can't say, I'll just, if you really want me to pick a bee, I'll pick Hesperapis rhodocerata, because it is such a great bee. It's like a seed, you pour water on the ground and out they come. It's great. There are records of 10-year diapause in solitary bees. Jerry Rosen kept a brood cell in his desk drawer at the American Museum for 10 years, and the bees finally came out. John.
Are there records of declines in solitary bees? And if there are reasons?
Yeah, great question. So yes, there is evidence of declines in solitary bees. It seems like the host plant specialists are the ones that get hit most noticeably. So when you modify a habitat, you kind of make it into a trashy habitat, you get the trash bees. So you lose all those specialist bees that rely on the very particular host plants that they need to survive. So specialists seem to be particularly vulnerable. But I'll admit the data isn't as good for the solitary bees as it is for the much more charismatic and widely known social bees. So we have a lot of information on bumblebee declines, for example, because people like collecting bumblebees. We have much less data on solitary bee declines. But we're starting to get it. You know, there are a lot of projects around the world now that are trying to do these kinds of longitudinal studies. We're doing a survey of the bees of New York with that goal in mind. You know, what are the species that are really under threat and which ones are in decline? So we're working on it, but the data isn't as good for the solitary bees. Casey?
Hi. Do you know of any kleptoparasitic bee hosts that actually have adaptations to combat these larvae with the large mandibles? Do they actually have any adaptations, also large mandibles or anything?
Yeah, I've never heard of anything like that, but that would make sense that we should be looking for that kind of thing. But yeah, no, I have never heard of an example of that. Mostly I can think of the adaptations that adult bees have to protect themselves from the brood parasites. Some bees close their nests while they're foraging, so they'll fill in the nest with soil, and they'll fly out, and then they'll come back and burrow in. So there's some camouflaging of the nest that goes on. Also, when they close the brood cells, they do it with a lot of effort, and they usually plug the brood cell with a soil plug. So, they do try to prevent the adults try to prevent the cells from getting parasitized. But I don't know of any examples in the larvae. Yeah.
I'm wondering if the commercial solitary bee nest things they sell could be fostering the parasites, because you're collecting a bunch of nests together that are normally scattered.
Yeah, they probably do. Yeah, you're talking about the nesting tubes, the little bee houses. Yeah, there's a nice study by Scott McIver looking at whether or not those houses are actually beneficial to preserving native bee species. Turns out that there are a lot of natives that not a lot of non-natives that like those bee houses, and so we may just be promoting the non-native species, unfortunately.
But the houses I've seen had a lot of, I don't know how much parasites they're supposed to have, but they seem to have a lot of parasites.
Yeah, they do. I think they accumulate parasites over time, that's for sure. Yep. You had a question.
Would you be willing to comment on the relative significance of these solitary bees as pollinators of apples, pears, whatever, versus honeybees?
Sure, yeah. We did a lot of work on apples. So it's very crop specific. So some crops we absolutely need honeybees for certain crops. Almonds are one of them. The native bee fauna isn't abundant. It's not diverse fauna. You aren't going to produce almonds with native bees. But in the eastern US, we have a lot of crops that are actually highly dependent on native bees. Apples, so we did a survey of apple orchards over a 10-year period from Lake Ontario to the Hudson Valley, and we found 120 species of native bees in New York visiting apples. So those bees are actually, turns out, more effective than honeybees on a per visit basis as pollinators. So apple growers are kind of not using honeybees as frequently as they used to. So if you scale up the orchard, then you need to bring in honeybees, but if you're working on a smaller scale orchard, less than 100 acres, the native bees probably do all the work that you need. So we're seeing that happen in apples. Squash and pumpkin is another example where native bees are going to be contributing. Blueberries, cranberries are all, there are native bees that visit those crops, and there are studies that suggest that the native bees are important crop pollinators. So yeah, I think we're starting to diversify our pollinator portfolio, and we're thinking about how to manage those native bees in a way that they will be taking over in case the grower doesn't get honeybees on a particular year. But yeah, we've done a lot of work on apples. We're very lucky in the eastern US. We have agricultural habitats interspersed with forest. We don't live in the Central Valley of California, so we have quite a lot of bee biodiversity around.
So this discussion about how much of our food supply is dependent upon bees is really kind of weird.
It's not weird, but we have a chapter on that in our book. But it's a difficult calculation to make. So you start with the value of the crop, and then you have a percentage of that crop that's dependent on pollination. Then you have to come up with a percentage of that pollination that's honeybees versus wild bees. People have made that calculation, but I think those estimates are often incorrect. And I think we still haven't gotten quite to the level of sophistication that we would need to really get a good estimate. But it's been done, and it's hard to know. I mean, it's hard to know how to partition those two things, honeybees versus native bees.
Because the honeybees weren't there.
Well, for eastern apple orchards, we'd be fine, I'm pretty sure. But for some crops in the Central Valley, we probably wouldn't be fine.
That's what somebody told me.
Yeah,
You mentioned the survey of native bees in New York State.
yeah.
Would you elaborate about the nature of that study, the extent, and particularly whether there are ways for amateur entomologists to share data or photographs or specimens that would be of value to you?
Sure. So we aren't doing the apple surveys to the level that we were doing them a few years ago, but we could have used some help to do those. Those involved net collecting transects through the orchards with a very specific protocol for a 15-minute transect, and we collected all the bees, we identified them all to species, and we eventually accumulated a pretty good data set. Cass Urban Mead is still working on that project to some extent, but she's moving off to the forest canopy now and exploring what the biodiversity of the forest canopy is in the early spring. But we are doing a statewide survey where we're really looking for amateur collectors to help us out. So I can put you in touch with the New York State Natural Heritage Program if you're interested in participating in that. That'd be great.
I was hoping you could talk a little bit about pesticides.
Yeah, that's a very, very hot topic right now. So my colleague Scott McArt, who may have scooted out here, has been doing a lot of very nice work on pesticides and sort of the risks of pesticides to pollinators. I mean, it's clear they're not good. We find pretty strong evidence that the pesticide use in apple orchards can impact the bee species richness and abundance in those apple orchards. I'm not going to recommend banning any particular kind of pesticides because they all have their own problems. I think the organophosphates are really bad, and we're phasing those out slowly. The neonicotinoids are considered to be very bad as well. So it's a tough world out there for a pollinator. Does that answer your question?
You talked about the bees that are specific to apples, and yet apples are the most sprayed. And that's what our region is known for, it's apple.
Yep, yeah, well, there was a student in my lab named Mia Park who did a nice study with our apple survey data and showed that pesticides do have an impact on species richness and abundance in the apple orchards. So the more heavily sprayed those orchards are, the less species and wild bee species they're going to have. But the apple growers do try to avoid spraying during peak bloom. I mean, they're working to try to minimize the impact they have on the native bees. But really, it varies among orchard growers and what their spray regimes are and what chemicals they're using. But I think we're getting the word out now that caution is important, and people are trying to switch when they can to alternative pesticides.
With that in mind, have the studies also reflected the difference between orchards that do integrated pest management, organic, and the conventional?
Yeah, we wanted to do that comparison, but we didn't have enough organic orchards to sample. We didn't, and also there was a problem that the organic orchards tend to be small, and we were comparing them to large conventional orchards, so it wasn't really a fair comparison. But I think the organic orchards are probably more bee-friendly, although I don't really have very good data to support that.
But the integrated pest management, is there?
Definitely, yeah. There's a group, Eco Apple group. Do you know about the Eco Apple group? They have a sort of spray regime that's very much informed by IPM thinking, and so they aren't organic, but they also they're very cautious about which pesticides they use. They don't use organophosphates. I don't think they use neonicotinoids. And their orchards are fantastic for bee species richness. So they're onto something. So if you want to look into Eco Apple, that's a spray, that's a group that follows a particular kind of regime for producing apples that's very low. It's not organic, but it's very It's minimal impact pesticide use.
Alongside of that, do they also have studies that show the bottom line in regards to if the IPM people are not spraying unnecessarily, then they're not wasting the money to do that, and then in the end, do the studies show that along with it, or?
Yeah, our pollinator group is working on that. So Scott McArt's lab has some work going on that, looking at the cost-benefit analysis of pesticide use to New York State apple producers.
And that's Scott who?
Scott McArt.
There's actually a handout in the exhibit upstairs. There's a handout from Scott McCart's lab. So if you go to the second floor and go to that gallery, there's a nice exhibit there, and there's actually a handout from his lab. So you can get up.
I mean, one thing we are finding, I'll just throw this out, is that fungicides seem to be much more damaging than we thought. Fungicides we think of fungicides as having low direct toxicity to bees, but we find again and again and again studies that suggest that fungicides have a really profound impact on the species richness and abundance. And we don't know quite why. It may be because they're disrupting the microbial communities of those solitary bees. Yeah.
Because of the emphasis on honeysuckle and agriculture and whatnot, if you look at the effects of non-native bee populations being generalist versus the native specialist species and how that affects in terms of resource availability.
So, can you restate that?
How non-native bee populations affect native bee populations?
Oh, great question. Right. Yes. Yeah, that is a very hot topic. So what is the impact of honeybees on native bee populations? And there have been a number of studies, and there's even a nice review paper on this, and it's surprisingly hard to show an impact. So here's the thinking. Honeybees are able to fly kilometers away, right? So they're going to the best resource over here that they can find. And therefore, they're leaving a lot of the other floral resources to the native bees, which are foraging on a much more local scale. So I'm just briefly summarizing what I think the thinking is, that we can't show really, very few studies have shown a really dramatic impact of honeybees on native bee foraging. But if you run the numbers, the amount of pollen that a honeybee colony brings in over the course of a year, if you convert that to the amount of pollen that would produce X number of solitary bee offspring, it's huge. But yet we can't detect that impact when we do studies. We don't see dramatic declines in bees in areas where there are honeybees. So I do think it's that honeybees are going for the richest floral rewards and leaving a lot of floral rewards for the natives.
One more question.
Yeah.
If there is.
One more question. All right, well, thank you very much.
This has been a production of Cornell University Library.